We're going to start off with two sides, and the first side will be the top part, and that will be where our circle starts at, and the second part will be our drop zone. And our drop zone is just going to be positioned at the bottom left and right, and it'll take up 50% of the screen. So the first thing that we need to do is set up some draggability. And so with that, we're going to need a few different pieces to hold on to. So we're going to say this.dragX is going to be a new value, set it to 0. This.dragY. And these are going to hold on to the current drag position of the moving circle. And then we'll move on to our offset. We'll say this.offsetX, and we're going to set it to the central point of the screen. So we'll say new value, and we've already brought in the width of the screen here. So we'll say width divided by 2. And then we'll say this.offsetY is equals to new value of just 100. So then, because we are doing a declarative approach with Reanimated, we need to hold on to the gesture state. So we'll say this.gestureState is equal to new value, and we'll set it to -1 because that is not any gesture state within the React Native gesture handler. And now we need to set up the event handler for our pan gesture handler. So we'll say this.onGestureEvent is equal to an event, and this comes from Reanimated. And for the first argument, we want to get the native event, which has a bunch of data on it, and we want to tell the React Native gesture handler to assign translation x to this.dragX, translation y to this.dragY, and then state to this.gestureState. So now that we have all of this set up, we can set up our conditions so that the circle will actually move when it's grabbed. So we need to do a this.transX and use the condition from Reanimated. And when our condition is met, which is when our drag state, our gesture state is active. So we'll say when it's equal this.gestureState to state.active, then we want to do certain things. And then we'll say this.transY, say when we're active, again, we want to do something. And because Reanimated is declarative, we can save a lot of time writing different bits of code by just saving off the declarative bits. So we can say const add y is just equal to add this.offsetY to this.dragY. And then the same for our x. So with this, what we can do is when our gesture state is active, the next argument will run. And in that case, we want to do our add x. And this will just take the offset x and the drag x, which the offset is just the position that it's moved across all drags. And then we add the current drag to it and then return that to the translation x. So basically, we are just moving it around and returning a new value while dragging. However, when we are no longer active, so the person has stopped moving the circle, then we want to save off the drag and the offset to the offset. So we can then say set this.offsetX and then just pass in our addX again. And so we'll do the same exact thing for our y. So we'll say add y. When the user is no longer dragging, we'll save off this.offsetY, which is a combination of add y. So now that we have our drag entirely set up, let's pipe these events in via props. So we're going to come down to our components, and we'll say onGestureEvent is equal to this.onGestureEvent that we created, and then onHandlerStateChange, which will just provide single changes, where onGestureEvent is a stream of events. We'll still pass in onGestureEvent. For our box here, we need to provide it with our transforms. So we'll say transform, which will take an array, and we'll provide a translate x, say this.transX, and a translate y, this.transY. So now you can see we can grab, drag, and drop. However, we want to alert the user whenever this circle is dropped and released within here. And so with Reanimated being purely native, there's no callback to the JavaScript world. So we'll need to implement that. So we'll first need to grab the dimensions of our drop zone. So we'll say on layout, we'll get we'll pass this.save drop zone, which doesn't exist yet. And then we'll go ahead and create it. So we'll say save drop zone. And this will receive an event. That event will have a width, height, x, and y, which we can use to calculate the dimensions of it on e.nativeEvent.layout. With that, we can get the top, bottom, left, and right of our drop zone. So we'll say this.top is just equal to our y. This.bottom is going to be equal to the y plus the height of our box. Our left will just be our x, and our right will be this.right is equal to x plus the width of our box. So now we'll then need a function that will be called for whenever we drop our box. So we'll create an OnDrop, and we'll receive an x and a y, and then eventually we'll do some logic here. But first, we need to do two things. The first is we need to bind our OnDrop to this for this particular component. So we'll say this.OnDrop is equal to this.OnDrop.bind this. And the reason that we're doing this in the constructor versus using class properties like we have here is that we need it to be bound to this before we pass it into our reanimated call. So at the moment, you cannot do you cannot pass in arbitrary stuff into Reanimated, so we'll just pick one of these, and we'll just do our trans y. And for the condition when we are done dragging, where we save off of our stuff, we're going to pass an array in instead. What this will allow us to do is add additional conditions to the inactive state whenever the user has completed their drag, but as long as this is the end, then this will be the value that's passed back to our trans y. So here we can say when the condition, and do another condition inside of our condition, and say when it's equal our gesture state to state.end, so whenever the user has completed their drag, we'll then do a call. And with that call, we want to pass in the values that we need. So in our case, the x and y, and eventually the second argument is the function that needs to be called. So because this happens, this saving and the ending of the drag happens in the same frame, we need to pass in our add x and add y, and then we'll pass in this.onDrop. So what this is going to do is in the same frame do the saving of, or doing the addition of the offsets during the drag, and then we'll just save off the offset y. So now if we add a comma here, we can reload this, and our OnDrop will now be called whenever we drop our x and y. So we need to then do some logic to alert that you have dropped it within the zone. So with our x and y, we can do some simple conditionals and say if the x is greater than or equal to this dot left, and the x is less than or equal to this dot right, and the y is greater than or equal to this dot top, and the y is less than or equal to this dot bottom, then that means that the circle has been dropped within this particular square. So with that, we can then just do an alert and say, you dropped it in the zone. So now if we move this around, we can see that our OnDrop is not firing. And then as soon as we drop it within the zone, it will alert us that the user has moved the circle within the zone.